following is a conversation with Dr. Jenna Macciochi, an immunologist, twice published author, TEDx speaker, public speaker, and all-around immune system expert. This one was a really good one. Jenna is a listener of the podcast, and we've been in communication for a long time about trying to make this happen. So it was an absolute pleasure and honor to have her in the studio today to talk about all things immune system, gut health, the microbiome, and even things like how do we improve the health of society more generally. Jenna truly is an expert. She's amazing at communicating and breaking down complicated concepts so that they're easy to understand for the listener. I learned an absolute ton over the course of this conversation, and I'm sure you will too. If you have an interest in the immune system, why you catch a cold, what you can do to maybe prevent you getting a cold, how to keep your immune system in top shape, how it changes as you age, just more generally, how to live a longer, healthier, happier life, you're going to get something out of today's conversation. Jenna's active on socials. We talk in the end about where you can reach her. I highly recommend you follow her and read her books, which I thought were absolutely excellent. This is Inside Matters. My name is Dr. James McElroy. I hope you enjoy it and you can take steps forward so that you can master your microbiome. I know you had a very strong sort of traditional scientific training. And
yeah.
I guess I did as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always fascinates me looking back was 7 years of medical school, physiology degree, not one single mention of breath work.
Yeah.
Not one single mention of minimally processed food and the importance of that.
Yeah.
Nothing on exercise, right?
Mind's blown.
And nothing on cold exposure, sauna, yoga. And it's like, that stuff's kind of important, isn't it?
Really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've written about a lot of this kind of stuff in your book. So maybe we could start with how did you get interested in the immune system?
Good
Big
place
question.
to start.
And then over the course of the conversation, I'd love to just delve into these other elements as means of making your immune system stronger and how that links back to your scientific training.
Yeah.
But let's start with the immune system and how you got interested.
How I got into it. I feel like I didn't have the best career guidance, let's say. Maybe none of us did at that time. But I grew up on a tiny farm in rural Scotland, and I guess you see the circle of life on a farm. And I was always really interested in what makes us well and what makes us sick. And my mum worked in food and catering, and she kind of believed that health was built at the kitchen table, and we grew a lot of food and learned to cook from her. And so I guess I always had that kind of interest in that area, and it was only when I was leaving school I just wanted to answer this big question of what makes us well, what makes us sick, and the immune system seemed to hold those answers. So I went to Glasgow, and that's where I did immunology. They have kind of a unique course because there's not too many places you can just do immunology. It's within the medical school of Glasgow University. I had the best tutors there, and it was it was about 18 of us, and from that point I was just in love with this topic. Wow. And it's just something that's kept on giving because there's more and more to learn. It's not like you kind of go through university, get taught everything about the immune system and you're like, right, I'm good now. It's like the last 20 years since I finished, I'm constantly learning. And that's probably what led me to write the books, was because after I had my kids, they're twins, so they're 9 now, so several years ago, and I wasn't working, first time in my career. I was on sort of a maternity break, and put them to bed as babies quite early. My husband was working long hours and commuting, and I just sit there with the scientific literature and just be like, right, what's happening? Who's publishing what? And I start making all these notes and just filling, huge Google Docs with notes on PubMed. And from that grew a book, just because your brain doesn't stop when you have kids. You still want to learn, and I still wanted to keep abreast of all the science. And so it was just those lonely evenings as my kids were asleep where I decided that this needed to go somewhere. And at the time, when you look at the books that were available on the immune system, they were so boring and outdated and so like, oh, I don't know, just felt like there was so much more that we could do with that area.
Your writing's very accessible, and the listeners should definitely check out your
Oh,
books.
thank you.
So the first one was The Science of Staying Well.
Yeah.
So maybe we can unpack that a little bit. So what were the kind of key themes within the book for the listener?
Yeah.
Without spoiling it, of course, because we hope they go and buy it if they haven't read it already.
Yeah.
But maybe, you know, what is wellness? What does it look like for you as the author and the expert? And what is the science underpinning all of that?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I think the inspiration with the book came from thinking about the evolution of the immune system. You know, it's one of the oldest preserved systems on the planet because everything alive needs some kind of immune system. Even plants have their own immune defenses because it's the way to protect yourself from, you know, things that want to eat you or infect you. And a lot of our understanding of the immune system has come from thinking about it as a way to protect from infection. So we use a lot of like military language, like defense system, going out to battle. And that in one sense makes sense. And I think that was really relevant for many years. So immunology kind of grew out of microbiology, the study of microbes, when we started to understand that it wasn't just like miasma, which is sort of bad air, the things that they thought made you sick, when they started to discover that there was cells in the body, the white blood cells, that were actually responsible for fighting infections. So immunology grew out of that, and it was really important because, you know, not that long ago, we used to die from infections more than in the UK we do now. And now we die from other things, so heart disease, metabolic conditions, certain cancers, a lot of age-related diseases that we're seeing coming in earlier and earlier. And my fascination was really that the immune system plays a really important role in these too, but we think about it as this infection protection system. And actually, we have to look at these non-communicable diseases that are not classically immune-related diseases, but we have to start thinking of them in terms of the immune system because it's sort of underpinning what's going wrong. Even things like certain mental health conditions, which again, we don't think about as being part of our immune system. But, you know, if you think about the last time you were unfortunate enough to get a fever, you know, you catch the flu and you feel low moods, you feel socially withdrawn, you change your appetite, you feel lethargic, you feel a lot of these things that are similar to somebody who's experiencing depression. And for a subset of people with depression, we know that inflammation, which is one of the immune system's weapons to fight infections, is actually raised in those people. And that can be for lots of reasons. So it's kind of like a low-grade version of what you feel when you have that fever and you have the flu. And we can then, there's trials giving people anti-inflammatory drugs, and they see an improvement in
the
depression.
Wow.
So I don't think we can say that that's for everyone with a mental health condition, but certainly a subset. And we call these sickness behaviors. So they're a sort of suite of behaviors that come from the inflammatory response. So there's a reason you feel them when you have the flu, because you don't want to spread your germs. You know, you want to withdraw from people. You want to be lethargic so that you're stuck on the sofa and you're not going to go and do your usual activities. They're protective. They're helping you get well as soon as possible. But when we have unwanted inflammation in the body, it's acting on the brain. There's receptors on the brain for that inflammation, and it's changing your mood and your behaviors in a similar way. It's kind of a misdirected response. It thinks that there's an infection. You know, you want to withdraw from the world. And to me, it just blew my mind that we just think about it in terms of infection, but there's this whole suite of different things that are now becoming the main causes of poor health that are not related to infection that we need to start focusing on.
Like chronic stress, perhaps? And
yep, exactly.
The modern day lifestyle, burnout.
Yeah.
I saw you posted something about burnout today. It'd be cool to discuss that, because that's kind of coming to the fore now as well. Where historically, I mean, the kind of circles that I work in, it used to be that the CEO lifestyle was you don't sleep at all, you drink a lot, you're on a plane all the time, you've got no time to exercise, and that's just how it is. But now I think there's a new era that's just starting, which is if you want to perform, you need to control your stress.
Yeah,
You need to
completely.
control your inflammation.
Yes.
And that sort of segues into all the things that you talk about in your book, which is the exercise, the diet, the sleep,
Yeah.
all these components that I think we all know are important.
Yeah.
So what kind of actionable insights do you kind of put forward within your writing and when you talk to people about what they can do to strengthen? We talked about boost, not sure if that's the right word, but really kind of get their immune system into the strongest possible state and think about that chronic inflammation as well.
Yeah. Well, when I was doing my PhD in London, I certainly felt the sting of burnout. Frequent colds and just no energy, and all of those, like that cascade of symptoms where you're just not recovering. So stress isn't necessarily supposed to be a bad thing. It can be quite motivating.
Yeah.
If you feel a bit of stress about an event, it helps you prepare, it helps you get ready, it gives you a boost of motivation. But when that's not matched with adequate recovery, then it starts to have this kind of negative effect. It's like you're constantly on the accelerator and you're never pressing the brake. And I was sort of thinking, I have all this knowledge at my fingertips. Like, why am I not applying it to myself? And so I think that's when I started the journey of like, okay, what do I know? What have I learning about? And how can I apply it to myself? And it is all the pillars of things that we know. It's all the stuff, like you're saying, we don't get taught in medical school about.
Or school.
Yeah, or school. Yeah. And I think about this a lot with my own kids. We're teaching them to like sit at a desk all day. When I look at the school meals that they offer, it's like, and I'm sure we can get to the microbiome, but it's very important for children, that we set that up in the early days of their life. But I think it can feel overwhelming that we need to do everything perfectly, and also people want the fancy stuff. So it is really cool to go on a wellness retreat or do the ice bath and the sauna and everything, but it's not going to fix anything if you're not doing the little things every day. So the little practices that just take the pressure valve and help you manage that. And it's almost like collecting your own toolbox of things for you. I'm remembering that there's a huge mismatch between how the world is and the inputs that our immune system needs to function well. So I often think that sometimes we get to that stage where we're like, we just need to be doing more like stress relief, like more meditation. And it's always that sort of flagellating ourselves that we've not done enough. And it's actually like, maybe the world's just too much. Maybe we're not meant to be working such crazy hours, commuting, just the pressures across the board of our life. And so that self-compassion piece, I think, is really interesting. And there's a really beautiful study where they taught people different self-compassion techniques. So
what does that mean? Sorry, the self-compassion.
Yeah, there's a very unique definition. I'll probably butcher if I try and describe it, but there's a definition of self-compassion, and it's like having a common sense of humanity, like, we're all in this together. It is really hard. Using sort of kind language to yourself, reminding yourself that you've given your best. And when people are taught to do this by professionals in the area, they, over a period of, I think it was 3 months, they found that they could lower levels of unwanted inflammation in the blood just by this self-compassion. Yeah, exactly. Wow. And that really, to me, is we've integrated the mind and body, but we don't think about it that way in terms of our kind of conventional approach. We separate the mind and body, but they're talking to each other all the time. And, your immune cells have receptors on the surface for the different neurotransmitters. And so there's a communication there. There's special immune cells in the brain that are helping to nurture that environment and make sure that cognitively and the physical health of the brain is there. And so there's that conversation going on all the time. So it's no wonder if we feel stressed that's going to have an impact on how our immune system's functioning. It all kind of weaves back to our evolution, like our bodies
could we go there a little bit? So maybe how did it all start about? How did the immune system become what it is? And probably a massive topic. But the essence of it.
Yeah,
guess,
I mean, it dates back millions of years because, like, as I said earlier, we need to have an immune system to survive. So from the earliest living things on the planet would have had a need for these immune defenses. And so it's been conserved throughout evolution for a really long time. And I guess it's quite expensive to run your immune system for your body. It's metabolically quite costly. And so we don't want to be pouring an investment into that all the time. So we sort of triage resources depending on what's needed. And so if you're stressed all the time, it's kind of emulating, if I'm about to step out on Oxford Street in front of a bus and I'm like, oh my God, that stress is going to get me to safety. It's going to suddenly give me a jolt of energy into my blood. It's going to give me that sharp focus that I need to get out of the way to safety. It's not going to be like, oh, we still need to work on that head cold that you have. It's going to be like, immune system, not necessary right now. Let's focus on the immediate things. And I think when we're stressed all the time, it's going to say to the immune system, no, that's not the priority. The priority is like that sort of burning need to get to safety that never quite comes because it's like, your job, your career, the treadmill of life. And so I think a lot of things make sense once you start to look through the lens of evolution. And the evolutionary mismatch theory in terms of the immune system is a theory whereby we don't get these inputs that we need from our environment. So your immune system is a sensing system. It's very much shaped by various inputs from your environment, things you do, things you're thinking, things you're exposed to, your food, your exercise, the environment. And when we don't get all the right inputs, it's like, it gets confused and then it starts acting up and we get things like allergies or autoimmune diseases. So it's a kind of very broad strokes way of saying that there's a mismatch between how our lives are set up and the things our immune systems need to work properly.
I'm going to push you a little bit on what we can do to try and recalibrate and realign.
Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of that might be within our control.
Yeah.
But I wonder if we could just take a step back and talk about the immune system and the components. So, very simply, I guess it's to protect us from foreign harmful things.
Yeah.
But there's also an element of helping us with our own insides as well. So if there are cells which are out of control, could you maybe just kind of encapsulate that as to what it is? And then we'll talk about what we can do about if it goes wrong or what we can do to prevent things from going wrong.
I think classically we've divided it into this innate and adaptive immune system. The innate is that first line of defense. Those are the white blood cells that are lining those body barriers, the nose, the throat, the airways, the gut, underneath the skin. So if anything gets through those barriers and could potentially harm us, you've got cells sitting there waiting. They've got little receptors on the surface that are looking for patterns of damage or danger that they can react immediately, raise that red flag and deal with the problem. And then you've got the adaptive immune system, which is a little bit more specific. And this is circulating around in your blood and lymphatics, in and out your lymph nodes, performing a bit of a surveillance function, looking out for things untoward. And that's the system that takes a little bit longer to get up and running. So it can take 5 days to get an adaptive immune response going. So sometimes, if you fall sick, you've got to give your immune system a little bit of time. Yeah, which none of us have. We want, get the symptoms fixed now. I always say time and rest are sort of the two things that we need to give our immune system first when we get sick.
Nobody wants to hear that.
Nobody wants to hear run to the pharmacy.
We want the pill.
I know. Buy all the stuff. And,
I'm also guilty.
Yeah, we all do it.
Totally guilty. Yeah.
And so there's so many different cell types and subtypes within the innate and the adaptive immune system, and then you have all the different organs, the thymus, the bone marrow, the spleen, the lymph nodes. And we tend to, historically, we've studied the immune system in terms of every different cell and its function. And I think now we're moving towards a more systems approach where we're like, okay, we know what they all do individually. Now we have to look at them holistically. And I think that's what's been missing. And now we're sort of moving towards that space. So while it's useful to understand all the different components, I think we also have to understand that they're not working in isolation. They're working all together.
And when it's working really well, how does that kind of look and feel for a particular person? And then we can talk about when it's not working
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
I think the first thing to say is that it's normal to get a couple of minor illnesses a year. Like, we live in a world full of germs. Do you know what I mean? They've always been here. They were here before us. And they're always trying to look for a way in. They're opportunistic. They want to infect us because we have these warm bodies with lots of nutrients where they can replicate and then, sneeze onto the next person. And so if you have any contact with other humans, I think it's normal that now and again, one or two viruses, get past the net. But it's thinking about the frequency of infections, how long it takes you to recover. If you have a sort of normal pattern, it's not like, you catch a cold and end up with pneumonia, like looking for red flags where things might not be right. And I think that's more useful than thinking sense. I just need to be invincible. Or when you get a cold, you're like, oh, I've got a rubbish immune system. It's like, well, no, it's doing its job. It's just, there's a lot, you're constantly being inundated with germs. So most of the time it's doing pretty well. One or two might get through. And it's kind of normal, I think, for adults to get about 4 or 5 infections a year, more for kids because, public health and hygiene with kids is a work in progress, reminding them to wash their hands and not like shove things in their mouth that they shouldn't. So, and also their immune systems are still developing, so they don't have the same exposure that adults have.
That's good to know that, 4 or 5 a year might be normal for some people because I don't know what other podcasts you follow. I'm not going to mention names, but there's a couple of podcasts that are like, well, if you do your breathing exercises every day and you do your cold plunge and you do your sauna every day, you just will never get sick. And you've got people saying, well, I've not been sick in 3 years on podcasts saying that. And that doesn't really sound correct, does it?
I know. I think, well, maybe think about the exposure piece as well. It's not just about your immune system. It's about what you're exposed to. So we're sitting here in London. If you go walk down the street and you go on the tube and you obviously have to touch things, that's a huge exposure. Whereas, if I go to visit my parents in rural Scotland, I barely see a soul for a week. There's less germs that I'm exposed to. So that's an important factor. So the people that haven't been sick for 3 years, and, they may not have the same exposure as somebody who lives in the middle of a city, has kids in nursery, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the London Underground, I think, is the most microbially diverse part of the world.
Amazing.
Genuinely, I think there are actually more microorganisms there because it's warm all year round.
Yeah.
It's damp, and if you think about the influx and kind of outgoings of people just every day from all over the world, it's a melting pot. So if you take the tube regularly, and if you have children who are mixing with lots of other children, they're kind of also typically carrying one or two things because your immune system's developing. Yeah. But, so people get really frustrated when they've got a cold.
They do, yeah.
And they beat themselves up.
Exactly.
So I think what you're saying is it's normal to have a couple every year. What about duration and when does it become not normal? You mentioned pneumonia as well. So.
Yeah, so I think think about that frequency. If suddenly you feel like you're getting more than normal and nothing else has changed, so you haven't just, decided to put your child into nursery or, more vehicles to bring germs home, you just can't shake it off or you're getting more sick than normal. I can think of times with colleagues where I'm like, oh my God, you're sick again. And I can see that they look tired. It's that burnout
it's
again.
It's the burnout thing, you think.
Yeah. And I can tell, like, looking at them, oh, I'm worried about you. And we don't have time to be sick. I think I always think like one day on the sofa and getting back on your feet quicker is better than powering through. 100%. And I have a personal story on this. It's really embarrassing. Right. So when my kids were very small and I went back to work and it was weird going back to work as a parent because I was just like, oh, you'd had that little break to have children. And I found it quite strange and stressful. We all got a cold, which is fine, everyone in our house. Husband and kids got well. I didn't. I continued, didn't take any time off work. I was like, it's just a cold. I woke up with a bone rattling cough. I couldn't get out of bed and I had pneumonia. And that was literally just from having a cold.
Wow, so it's possible then.
It is,
if you don't take the steps.
Yeah, I was so run down. I was so not looking after myself. And it's just that classic, like, mum, back to work, like putting everyone else's needs first and navigating that path of being at work again now with children, which before when you're at work, you just think about yourself. You don't have these dependents to consider as well. And so it's really easily done. And I'm a real advocate for if someone is sick, don't go into work. Nobody wants your germs to start with. You know, when that person comes into the office and you're like,
gym.
oh, yes, or the gym. Yeah. And, people don't want to miss those opportunities. Like, if you're really, on it with your gym schedule, that you don't want to have to miss that class. But honestly, like, in terms of you're transmitting to other people who don't want it, but just take that rest and you'll be much better for it than instead of pushing through. But I think that's a kind of cultural thing that we need to challenge.
Just keep going. Same in America. So I'm sure people ask this all the time, but I'm going to ask it. So if someone has a cold, what should they do? Like, what are the actual evidence-based, well-researched methodologies, tools, supplements, whatever? And I think what you're going to say is rest. But I'd like you to say that.
Yeah.
Then we can maybe talk about the other stuff.
Yeah, definitely rest and definitely time, because your immune system is really energetically costly. And, it takes about 10% of your basal metabolic rate. And then when you have a fever, that's climbing up. For every degree of fever, it's climbing by a few percent. So, your body is suddenly it's only got so much energy, and it's suddenly having to triage loads into your immune system. So it doesn't also need you running around doing your normal daily stuff, because you're just then stretching that energy budget really thin, and then risking being sick for longer. So rest is really important. And that is why we feel tired when we're sick. And that's to do with the action of the inflammatory mediators on the brain, trying to tell your brain, change the behavior, because this is going to get as well quickly. So rest is really important. Time is really important. And then, there isn't a magic cure. I'm not an advocate for like running to the pharmacy and taking all the over-the-counter medicines, because these are acting on the symptoms. So they're suppressing the symptoms, the headache, the stuffy nose, the fever, the cough, but they're not getting rid of that virus or whatever's causing the infection.
That's the immune system.
That's the immune system, which is needing the rest and time. And so there's a potential that you suppress the symptoms, you feel better, so you go to work and do all your normal stuff, but you're not giving your immune system the rest and time. So I think that they're great, but you could save yourself some money and just rest.
And the reason people get these symptoms is, I'm assuming it's because the immune system kicks in. Yeah. The virus is there. Yeah. And cells start migrating. That kind of, we talked about the army, but all those sort of innate cells and more specialized cells start to kick in at different points. Is that why?
Yeah, so you breathe in the virus to your lungs. If we take that as an example, your innate immune cells that are lining the airways are like, oh, wait a minute, there's something going on. That virus is replicating. They usually have a really quick replication time, but your immune system is calling in more backup cells to try and do the job. And it's, basically just trying to fight off, make that environment really hostile for the germ, which has a bit of collateral for how you feel, which is, okay, if it's for a day or two, that's fine, because your body can recover. So you just kind of have to take that collateral as part of the immune system doing its job.
Okay, that makes sense.
But I guess we don't like feeling uncomfortable and.
No, absolutely not.
I tell this to my husband all the time, but he'll still run to the pharmacy and take all the things. You just spent 20 quid and
he knows better. I guess, I'm probably guilty for that as well. I'm a busy person.
Yeah, for sure.
Symptoms. No, I need them fixed as soon as possible. And there's a whole myriad, an almost infinite number of potential cures.
Yes, yeah.
Ranging from, if I think back to when my granny was alive, putting Vicks on your feet and putting socks on top of your Vicks in your feet.
There's lots of things about feet and socks.
So is there any scientific backing for that?
I haven't come across anything to do with things with your feet and socks. I mean, it might still be out there. There might be some obscure paper that I just haven't read yet. And I like to keep an open mind. But there is a little bit of evidence that we know that obviously we talked about how the immune system is really energy intensive. So when it is working hard, it does need more energy and it needs more resources. So things like vitamin C and zinc are the two kind of classic immune supporting micronutrients, and we start using these in greater amounts when we are fighting off an infection. So there's some evidence that if you start taking these upon onset of symptoms, you might be able to cut your illness shorter by a little bit, but it's quite small, particularly if you are someone who's really busy or an athlete or someone who trains a lot, because you just might be needing a bit more.
Do you recommend supplements for people more generally, and if so, what are they?
If you're doing the rest and the time, if you've got those ticked, then if you want to throw things at it, then I zinc lozenges is a good one to keep in the cupboard. Vitamin C, if you've got a good diet, I don't think you need to take it every day. But again, at the onset of symptoms, I think there's lots of interesting stuff coming up with different functional mushrooms and the immune system. And these might be working on lots of different levels. So we've got culinary mushrooms, like things like your white button mushrooms, but then there's what we call sort of functional mushrooms, which are edible and you can certainly cook with them, but they also have these additional compounds, which many of them seem to be what we call immune modulating. So they seem to work by helping the immune system do its job, but stopping it sort of going a bit too far with that inflammatory response. So it is really, really interesting. And I think there's something in this that we haven't fully explored yet. So that's an area, that's something that I would consider would be the mushrooms.
Watch the space then for mushroom research. And are these coming to the fore in terms of potential drugs, or is it more of like a dietary supplement, nutraceutical type thing?
It's more nutraceuticals, but there are clinical trials, and particularly in the cancer field, there's lots of clinical trials looking at these as a way to sort of modulate how chemotherapies are working and how people are responding to chemo and some of the side effects. So really, really interesting to look at. So things like reishi mushroom is a great one. Lion's mane, lots of cognitive benefits. Chaga's a really good one for the immune system. And also these have lots of beta-glucans, so fibers in them. So we know they're also having an effect on the gut. And obviously we know the gut is really important for the immune system too.
So a lot of people say that, just on the subject of the gut, there's 70% of your immune cells living on and inside of your gut. Yeah. Is there any truth to that? And if so, how does it come about?
Yeah, I think that has come around from sort of estimates. I have actually looked for the original source of that and I haven't been able to find it. But I mean, we do know that there's a huge number of white blood cells lining everything from your mouth to your other end. So perhaps if you were to proportionally count those up, compared to other bits of the body, it might be a large percentage.
Kind of makes sense.
Kind of makes sense.
I guess for the listener, and we've talked about it so many times in this podcast, that there is literally this one cell thick, and by the way, a cell is very small, tiny. Very microscopic, very, very small, one cell thick barrier between what you could describe, if you were being pretty kind of sort of vulgar about it, a sewer, right? And another part of your body, which is, commonly thought of as being sterile. It's kind of not sterile because nothing's really 100% sterile.
But you certainly don't want the sewer in the
absolutely
other
not.
bit.
And when it happens, you've got a huge problem. Things start going crazy. So I guess it kind of makes sense that lining that one cell thick barrier are your defense mechanisms, right?
Exactly.
Just in case if something finds its way through,
it's just like that, breathing in the virus, you've got lots of immune cells in the airways. I mean, the gut is this huge opening to the environment. All that exposure to things all day long, breathing, swallowing, food you eat, it's all getting chucked down there. And your immune system's got to deal with whatever
it's
ends
incredible,
up.
actually.
Yeah, I think it's incredible.
Like it's amazing that maybe we don't get sick more often.
I know. Yeah, exactly. That's what I think.
Right?
When people get the odd cold, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like that, your immune system is amazing.
Exactly. It's been working so hard. Think about how many times you've been on the tube, how many times you touched something and it's gone into your mouth. Your immune systems find a way just to move it on. That. So on the mushroom side then, how did you kind of get interested in this emerging field? Is it like well known amongst people working in immunology? That
I think it was when I started going into the diet more, and probably when I was writing the books. And obviously we talked about things to take when you get sick, and of which, vitamin C and zinc probably have the most evidence. And then there's sort of more niche botanicals where there's sort of emerging evidence. But I was kind of then thinking about what can we take all the time or frequently that is going to be more preventative. And I think that's where I came across the mushrooms. Not only do they have these different kind of not phytonutrients, but we call them micronutrients because they're with a mushroom, not a plant. But they have, they're a source of fiber, and these fibers seem to have a particular signaling mechanism on immune cells that modulates their behavior in a really favorable way.
And there's something to do with the microbiome as well, isn't there? So
yes.
There's some prebiotics
exactly in there. Yeah. So it's not necessarily that you want to maybe take it as a supplement. It might be that we want to eat them as our ancestors might have done. And I know in Brighton where I live, you can literally buy a whole lion's mane in some of the local grocery shops. Yeah. I've never tried cooking it, but I think, you can marinate it and
Apparently it tastes quite good.
Yeah, it looks quite nice.
Mushrooms more generally just taste really awesome. And
they have a lovely kind of meaty texture, don't they?
There might be something sort of evolutionary in all of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's always a bit of wisdom in evolution, and we kind of want to work it all out with the science and then go, we've discovered it. And it's like, well,
it's been there forever.
Yeah.
So back then to the kind of core principles then of wellness. What are the kind of big buckets then that people should be thinking about on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think movement is just so important for our immune system. We don't often put the two together. We always think about diet and supplements, but exercise, we're built to locomote, and the immune cells are circulating around our body in our blood and lymphatics. And the lymphatic system is a circulatory system, but it doesn't have the heart as its pump. It requires our muscles to move to be a pump. So if you don't move, you're not using the lymphatic system to its full potential. And it allows the immune cells to recirculate around, but it also carries metabolic waste from all the different cells of your body that it drains and helps kind of dump that out of the body. So it's kind of a waste disposal system too, and sort of keeping on top of that. So I think muscle is particularly interesting. And we now talk about, within my field anyway, we talk about muscle and fat as being immunologically active tissues. I think this is a really new way of thinking. I think, when I was at university 20 years ago, they weren't telling me that muscle and fat were immunologically active.
And what does that kind of mean? It means that they have an influence on the immune system?
They have an influence. They're also a home of immune cells. So you have lots of immune cells that like to live there. And it means that the proportion of muscle and fat in a person's overall body composition can have a huge impact on the overall function of the immune system, and also the overall kind of inflammatory load. If we think about, we have inflammation to fight off infections, but we can also have unwanted inflammation in the body, which is leading towards chronic disease risk. And fat cells, as we gain weight and get our body weight above a threshold, then those fat cells can only store so much fat, but they have to store more because you're putting more food in the system, and they get quite stressed and they become a source of inflammation in themselves, which I think is really, when we think about obesity and people who are living with obesity, like they have raised inflammation. And so it's not only about the fat cells, but often what we see with obesity is a reduction in muscle, which tends to be more anti-inflammatory, and it's very sort of rejuvenating on the immune system. So it's really about the composition of the body, not just about putting on weight, but keeping a hold of that muscle mass as well. So I think living with obesity but doing muscle strengthening exercises is a really good way to keep your body healthy. And I think we all know that as a nation we're getting too heavy. Our lives are getting more sedentary, and this is starting younger and younger. I think it used to be like middle age was when there was a real kind of shift and body composition would start to change. But now, particularly, I think COVID seemed to be a bit of a threshold with children.
And that's very concerning, isn't it?
I think so. I think it's much harder to turn that tide. Any adult who's tried to lose weight will say how hard it is.
So hard.
But when you have a child who's not had so many years on the planet, that's much harder to change that trajectory unless you have a lot of support and intervention very early.
Can I just bring us back to something you said, which I think is fascinating, which was when fat cells expand, they get a little bit stressed.
Yeah.
And I think what we're talking about is when people gain weight, people might think that there's just tons of new fat cells appearing.
Yeah.
But actually, I think what you're saying is they just get bigger.
Yeah.
They're like balloons that you just blow up and blow up and blow up. So
yeah, exactly. There's almost like a threshold of the number of fat cells. I think some people are better at making new fat cells, and so their bodies kind of deal with being fatter better.
Interesting.
And for other people, it's
Wow.
there's the storage is full, and you're trying to keep putting stuff in there, and it's a source of cellular stress. And our immune system is not only designed to detect viral, bacterial infections, those kind of things, but it has receptors for what we call damage-associated molecular patterns. So cellular damage or cells that are stressed, it can detect that, and that to an immune cell is a reason to become inflammatory. Something's gone wrong. We need inflammation. We need to call in more backup. We need to try and deal with this situation. But actually, because there isn't a way to resolve that quickly, it then becomes a sort of global problem for the body.
Because the immune system, I guess, and this is a concept I've heard you speaking about before, is kind of spring cleans and sorts stuff out if it's not really working properly. So if a cell's a little bit damaged, it's probably better it's gone rather than sticking around.
Yeah, exactly.
And what you're saying is, well, if there's loads of cells that are getting stretched and damaged, then the immune system's going, I need to go there, and that's a stress on the body, right? And that has knock-on impacts and so on. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. So does that mean, therefore, that body composition is important more generally for the status of your immune system? So you should be moving more, and maybe it sounds like lifting weights as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the cardiovascular stuff obviously is getting everything moving, that vascular health, the lymphatic flow, that immune surveillance function, so looking out around your body for things going wrong. And then you have the muscle strengthening, and we just know how important that is as we get older. Like, it's really hard to hang on to your muscle. My poor 95-year-old grandfather still lived on his own in Scotland, and he was up on his roof cleaning his chimney at 95 years old, and he fell off onto a flat roof of a garage. Somehow didn't manage to break a bone, but then he was really badly injured, went into hospital. Within weeks he couldn't walk. Because just by being immobile at 95, your muscle, if you don't use it, you lose it. 100%. And particularly as you get older, it's really, really hard. So, we've all heard of the government advice on exercise, and it's like so many 100 minutes of cardiovascular and 2 muscle strengthening sessions per week. Nobody remembers that part. It's just like, I've got to go for a walk or a run or a cycle or a gym class.
I actually didn't know that they had that in their guidelines. I didn't know
that. It's kind of plays second fiddle. It's there.
Wow. Okay.
And also, I think muscle strengthening exercise for a lot of people is a bit vague. And, if you've never been to a gym or never done kind of classic, exercise per se, it's a bit like, well, what does that mean? Where do you start? And, if you're, 55 and never set foot in a gym before, it's really intimidating. And so it's challenging. And I think if we go back to people like my grandfather, like, he would just have been active in a way that he was putting resistance on his muscles, in a way that we've
on the farm.
On the farm. He's sort of we've engineered that out of our lives. So not only do we not really need to walk, but we don't really need to pick heavy stuff up either.
Well, we can order our food on our phone and it arrives, and all we have to do is sit up and just go to the door. And that's it.
Exactly.
It's incredible. I mean, it's amazing that we've managed to create a world where it's possible to do that. I think that's quite incredible. Versus what it was back in the day, if I can call it that, where we had to just run around for hours and hours to find something to eat. It's amazing.
Exactly.
However, the flip is, what it does mean is that probably on a day-to-day basis, we're doing way less than we were.
Exactly. You have to work really hard to bring it in.
And this is something I've heard you speak about as well, which is that the world around us, the world we've created, is maybe having an adverse effect on our bodies.
For sure.
And we need to work hard to prevent the world around us from having that negative impact. So movement.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I'm really passionate about is thinking about the whole entire life course. I don't necessarily want to live till I'm, 120, but I don't want the last few decades to be quite, limited in what I can do, because I think that doesn't sound very appealing either. But we know that the immune age, there's ways that we can now measure the immune age is in a research capacity, not in terms of, a
That's
consumer test. But we know that the immune age is not necessarily tracking to your chronological age. And there's this lovely studies done by Professor Janet Lord in Birmingham University, looking at sedentary young people in their 20s and 30s versus very active older people in their 70s and 80s who are using their muscles, who are looking after their muscle mass. They're doing activities where the muscles are working, so they're releasing things called myokines, which have this rejuvenating effect on the thymus gland, which is in the neck. And the thymus gland is where we produce our T cells. So these are kind of the master controllers of the adaptive immune system. And she found that these older adults who were really active had a thymus that was younger than their actual age, versus the sedentary younger people whose thymus was actually older. So this was just kind of mind-blowing for me.
That is crazy.
Yeah, thymic involution, which is where your thymus shrinks, it actually starts in your 20s. So you have this really long, slow decline of the thymus, and then the T cell compartment, with that. But it just shows us that we've got some ability to change that trajectory. And so you can work hard to have your immune system younger than your actual age, which I think is really appealing.
As an expert, is it ever too late for someone to start? Or is it one of these things where, it's a slow decline, but at any point between today and the day that you sadly pass away, you can intervene? Is that the case? Like, can you take action now? And
I think you can take action now. I think we don't know for sure what that's going to look like for different people starting at different ages, but I think there's always something to gain. And if it's not for your thymus, but it's for all the other benefits, there's definitely
because a lot of these things like age-related sarcopenia, which is just essentially you're getting older and your muscles are sort of declining and atrophying, actually that's entirely avoidable.
Yes.
If you lift heavy weights, or at least do resistance training. So all of this stuff that we just associate with age as being inevitable sounds like maybe is within our control.
Exactly.
And so on. Can I get a bit nerdy and talk about like immune system age? So like, what do? Do you measure the number of immune cells?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different ways that they can do it. It's a lot of taking a lot of different data points, looking at markers of senescent cells. So these are cells that are, they kind of come to the end of their life, and they should really apoptose, which is to die in a very controlled way to get rid of them. But instead they kind of turn into a bit of a zombie cell. So they hang around, they spit out lots of inflammatory components, and they actually pollute their little environment and make the cells around them into zombies too. And so we know that this immune senescence is really a critical feature of immune age. So there's the variety of different markers that we can look for levels of senescence.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And there's also entrepreneurs targeting senescent cells.
Yes. Senolytics is becoming a really interesting field. And actually there's, like certain cancer drugs are being repurposed as senolytics and combining them with certain phytonutrients, so quercetin, which is found in like apples and onions. This is a really cool senolytic, as well as fisetin, I think you pronounce it.
Tried them both.
And they have this kind
Bought them extensively over the years.
Pulse protocol, which is because cells are always senescing, and we're always removing senescent cells. But it's when that balance sort of tips to a critical threshold that we have too many senescent cells, that inflammation level starts to fill. So your sort of inflammatory bucket is filling faster than it's emptying. And they think that this sort of pulse method, where you don't have to, it's like you're pruning the leaves from a tree. You prune the brown leaves that are a bit dead, and that makes room for the new ones to grow. But if you prune every day, you'll have nothing left. So you don't necessarily want to hit with senolytics every day. you might want to pulse it. I think we don't quite know the protocol, but there's a couple of really nice studies in the last few years that have tried different approaches. So it might be once a month you have your senolytic cocktail, and that helps you keep below this threshold of senescence.
So I'll give you some insight. I, at one point, was a senolytic everyday kind of guy, and I was trying them all.
You're pruning the leaves.
Well, I'm glad you said. You know, the research on all of these things like rapamycin, metformin, senolytics, and anything else that's kind of experimental. I mean, quercetin and fisetin are bioflavonoids.
Yeah.
And there's maybe other benefits associated with them as part of polyphenols, like for the microbiome, for example.
Exactly.
But I was taking them every day. And then I had a conversation on this podcast with someone called Dr. Petra Louis, who was one of the first people I ever spoke to about my interest in the microbiome. It's an interesting episode, but basically she just completely challenged all of my thinking on supplements.
Interesting.
And it got me thinking a little bit. It's like I'm spending quite a lot of money on all of these supplements every month. And I'm just going to stop all of them and see if I feel any different and I notice any difference to my sleep, which I track.
Yeah.
Gym performance, which I also kind of track as well. And just kind of how I look in the mirror, which I think is kind of important as well.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be really honest with you, I actually noticed no difference at all to really anything. And I was spending quite a lot of money on quercetin and fisetin and all these kinds of things. And I'm now going to slowly reintroduce and just see what happens.
Yeah.
Some things like a really high quality fish oil, a vitamin D supplement between probably September and March every year in the UK. Creatine's probably pretty good as well.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of creatine.
Pretty good. And then see what happens with the other experimental things.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to what you were saying, it sounds like maybe you shouldn't take these things every day.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely these kind of hit and run protocols that are being
fascinating.
That are being evaluated. I'd have to look up the studies to know the sort of doses and timings they go with. But I think, you know, essentially they're kind of stabbing in the dark, trying to figure out how to translate this into something that humans can do. So I don't think we have an idea yet, but hopefully that's not long, you know, before it's like, okay, you pulsing your quercetin this many times a year, and that becomes a
staple.
Help you. Yeah,
that's
exactly. Cool. Which I think is cool.
The field is really evolving.
Yeah, it's not going to be that long, I'm sure.
So why don't we talk about one of the other pillars that you talk about, which is sleep. So how important is sleep for your immune system?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you spoke to me when I got pneumonia, I would have said that sleep was the most important pillar upon which everything else was built, because I was just particularly struggling with sleep at that point. And I think combination of having young children, but also the mental load. I would wake up in the middle of the night, just like bang awake,
buzzing,
thinking about everything I had to do, and couldn't go back to sleep. So was sleeping really, really badly. And there's lots of lovely studies looking at length of sleep. I still think that we don't quite know the length that any given individual needs. I think the 8 hours is a great benchmark to aim for. There's sort of discussions around how a lot of sleep literature has been done on men, and maybe women need a different amount of sleep. Different stages of life might need a different amount of sleep. But I think it's good to aim for a schedule where you feel good when you wake up and you're not just waking up tired. And, you know, if you think about, again, going back to the evolution aspect, when you go out and about during the day, we're meant to be awake during the day. We're sort of programmed that way. It's dialed into our DNA. That's when you're exposed to germs, isn't it? You know, you're out on the street, you go to work, you're going about your day.
Makes sense.
When you're in your bed at night, it's less likely that you're going to come across germs and things, less likely you're going to get injured and need an inflammatory response. So your immune system kind of switches gears, and it's got a different kind of, it's more of a housekeeping response at night.
The spring cleaning element.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of needs those two opportunities, the day and night. And pretty much all of the immune cells are under some kind of circadian control. So they have, you know, these clock genes that will be switched on when we get outside in the daylight. So, you know, I don't know how much, I'm sure you're really in tune with the circadian biology, but you know, when you see the sunlight and it's hitting your eye and telling your brain that it's daylight, it's time to be sort of metabolically active.
Kicks off.
Yeah, and then you get all the kind of trickle down effect, and all the little switches say, okay, now time to wake up. And so your immune system is controlled by that too, because it needs to know when you're likely to be awake and out and about versus at sleep. So it's really, really important. I think sleep's really come under the focus in the wellness community, which is good because it probably is something that people would compromise on. And I think we're a species who will sit up and watch Netflix when we're really tired.
Some of it's addictive though.
Yeah.
I just started this new one, the 3 body problem.
Oh, not heard of
Recommend.
that. Sounds interesting.
Recommend. I watched the first one and I was like, oh, that's not very good. But then me and my girlfriend watched the second one. We were like, oh. And they always finish. They always finish on something where you're like,
you just want to
no, we've got to binge now and do the next one. So I relate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think about other animals. They're like, I need to sleep. I'm going to go to sleep. Yeah.
Like your cats, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely.
Good life.
It's a good idea to, take inspiration from cats. But so sleep is really, really important. And there's lots of studies around like the number of hours of sleep and your risk of getting like a cold or flu. And particularly a cell type called the natural killer cell. As the name suggests, it is a killer, and it will kill cells of your cells when they're infected with a virus, and they seem to be particularly impacted by poor sleep.
Interesting.
And they're part of your sort of first line defense against viral infections. So it does make sense that, if you have poor sleep and then you're exposed to viruses, you're maybe going to be more vulnerable to getting a full infection.
What are the kind of tips and tricks that you use now as someone who for a while had poor sleep?
Yeah.
You're very, very busy. With lots of different things. You're very active on your socials. You've got a big following.
Yeah.
Kind of famous, actually. You're kind of famous. So how are you managing it all? And what is your kind of bedtime routine then that people can maybe learn from?
Yeah, do you know what is funny? Because I think if you look on social media, you get all the sleep protocols.
There's so many, right?
There's so many, and it's like really strict, and like people, they start their bedtime routine like this many hours before bedtime, and it's like really, I can't do that. I'm not that kind of strict protocol person. I'm quite intuitive, and so I did cycle through all the sleep hygiene and looked at the evidence of it. Having the bedroom dark and cool and clutter free. Trying to get off screens as early as possible in the evening, trying to get off tasks that, might stress me out too close to bedtime. And what I realized is
food?
that...
What about diet? Eating just before bed?
Yeah, I definitely feel... because I've got young kids, I eat quite early with them. So, but if I go out for dinner with friends and, the table's not booked till 8 o'clock, I'm like, oh, Jesus, I'm not going to sleep tonight. Yep. And then you throw in some wine on top of that. And
sleep score.
Yeah, game over. But yeah, the consistency I think is really important, because it's almost like giving your body a reminder. This is when we sleep, this is when we wake. So it can start to prepare all those little genetic switches for the right time. The same with diet, like eating at the right time. The consistent time, I think, is really important. So I came to the conclusion that sleep hygiene is necessary to get good sleep, but it's not sufficient. And for me, it was really like that mental load piece. It's like, oh, I'm doing everything right. I'm going to bed and I'm doing my evening routine and I'm ticking all the boxes for sleep hygiene, but I'm still not sleeping well. And it was only when I really came to terms with that and was like, okay, go sort out what's in my brain. And there's a million different ways to do that. There's a really good book by, I think it's Colin Espy, who it's basically CBT for insomnia in a book form.
Wow.
So, CBT for insomnia, I think, is the most evidence-based approach to dealing with sleep issues. But obviously, if you can't go and see a specialist, then he sort of laid it all out in a book, which I think is really helpful. The other thing that I love is a weighted blanket. Now, I've known about these for years, and I didn't. They're quite expensive, and I was like, oh, probably wouldn't work, and da-da-da-da. And then I just bought one last year, and it's been quite life-changing.
Whoa! Yeah. Life-changing?
Yeah, and so I'm not suggesting that will work for everyone, and I actually don't know about the evidence for it, but for me, it's been fab. But I think in terms of the stress response, our ancestors would have slept under heavy blankets, and it would have been quite protected. We didn't have central heating, if you imagine the weight of animal skins or whatever. And I just think it kind of
soothes.
Yeah, you feel very like encapsulated, and you like almost can't get up because it's weighing down on you. Okay. And I think it kind of puts a pressure on you that I don't know. I think there's something in it. I don't know the the science, but
thank you for that.
Yeah, I think
I don't have one. I'm kind of,
and it looks quite nice. Just looks like a blanket, even though it's really heavy to pick up. So
how heavy are we talking? It's like presses on your skin.
I think it's about 10 kilos. This one, you get.
That's pretty
weights.
heavy.
That's really heavy
for a blanket. That's serious.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can just buy it off the internet.
Yeah. I think I saw an advert for one in the sale, and that was what prompted me, because they tend to be a bit pricey. Yeah.
I've definitely heard people talking about it. I've tried most things as well. Certainly, the thing that impacts on my sleep score the most is a really, really stressful day.
Yeah.
So I can have a sleep score of 0% if something bad has happened at work.
And you can't sort of shake it off. It's there when you.
Unfortunately, and you can try everything. You can do the breathing. You can go to the gym. You can do sauna. But if something's really on your mind, it's going to linger there for a while.
Yeah.
And some people are just amazing at going, the problem will still be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm out. But I also think a little bit like if your subconscious mind is really going, it's trying to work through the problem, and you just have to be at peace with that for a while.
Exactly. It's finding that way out, isn't it?
A massage really helps.
Yeah.
Like a deep tissue massage I find really, really helps. Just switch off. I'm not giving you all my sleep tips.
But that could also be like the pressure,
Just about to say.
So maybe the weighted blanket is...
Maybe it's the same kind of thing that's going on. Some just deeply relaxing effect of the pressure on your body for some reason that I don't know. So it sounds like you don't have one of these crazy at 5 o'clock this happens, at 6 o'clock this happens. I've never understood how people do that.
I just think maybe they don't have kids, because
maybe they don't have kids or maybe they don't actually do it.
Yeah, they maybe
I think
don't
that as
actually
well
do
on
it.
social media.
And it's quite stressful to be so rigid, I think, as well.
For
like
sure.
I almost think about the people I speak to are really struggling, and they're like, and now I've got to do this, and it's another thing to do, and we're always like adding more things to do, and sometimes it's like letting go and having less to do is better.
That's one of the take homes from today's conversation for me, which I think is really good. So I would like to talk about social media. I also would like to talk about children and how to kind of do your best to make sure they've got the best chance of having a strong immune system. But I'm going to go back just quickly to the exercise bit, because I had noted down, I wanted to ask you about, very often when athletes are coming to peak week, for example, or they do a lot of triathlon, like long distance stuff, they're kind of unwell all the time. And I often think that they just don't look very well.
Yeah.
So is it the case that, again, coming back to doing less, you can do too much exercise and it impacts your immune system negatively?
Yeah, definitely. I think athletes are a really specific case as well, because we look at them as being this pinnacle of health, but often it's really unsustainable. It's for a specific end goal. They are pushing themselves to achieve a specific goal, which is not necessarily the most healthy thing in the world. It's for a purpose, and we call it so the sort of functional overreaching, where you're pushing an athlete beyond their constraints to get them to adapt, and then at a certain point that becomes non-functional overreaching, and that's because exercise is a stress, is a massive hit of cortisol, and you need the recovery time and the resource and the right nutrients and enough energy in the system. And so when that is a mismatch, then you get this massive crash, and it happens a lot. It's for any coaches out there, it'd be a really difficult thing to kind of to balance.
If they crash, then does that bring us back to burnout and the same kind of symptoms?
Effectively. And I think it's not just athletes, but people who are really seriously into the gym, who are training for events, but also have a really stressful job, and like working, 50, 60 hours, have kids, all sorts of things. Like, I think they're really vulnerable too.
Burning the candle.
And they probably don't have the luxury of a coach and a nutritionist and a sports psychologist as a professional athlete would. But I think the other thing with athletes is if you go to an event, or if you've traveled to an event, you're in a new environment, there's new germs, like athletes getting sick.
That's really interesting.
Around an event is a huge issue. And also during the training period, if you get that non-functional overreaching and you are in that sort of burnout state, you're much more vulnerable to an infection. That will take you out of your training program, which might take you away from your goal. So I think it's great to have a specific goal, but not if it's going to mean that you're more vulnerable to getting sick.
Because the other flip to it is, I guess, exercise is a coping mechanism for stress because
Yeah.
although it is a stressor, you get all the endorphins,
Yeah.
which make you feel better.
Yeah,
But I guess if you do
exactly.
too much, then it can all just compound and it can become
Yeah.
a damaging thing.
Yeah, the recovery piece is really important, and
I'm-
it's harder to gauge that often. It's harder to know how much recovery you have.
How do you know? Is there any way of knowing
Well,
how
I think it's the
recovered your immune
telltale
system is?
signs,
Yeah.
you know, as we've spoken about. But it's sort of it's easy to just push on through until it's too late, I think.
Yep. And I'll just take you back as well to, I guess, CEOs that I work with and that I know as well. And they do just push their body and mind to the absolute limit because they feel like they have to.
Yeah.
And those that are into the gym as well and exercise typically have ridiculous targets in the gym, or they want to do Ironman or
Yes,
whatever. I often do. And sometimes maybe less is more.
Yeah.
Maybe just taking a step back and going,
Yeah.
hang on a second, I don't need to train today. It's
Yeah.
going to have really no impact. And that's something that I've taken away from this conversation is actually less is more, and you have to listen to your body.
And I think that relationship with that activity, whether it's your relationship with food or your relationship with exercise, thinking about when it's crossed the line to being not a good relationship. And, you know, that can be quite subtle. And what is it because you're avoiding something else? You know, it's hard to just sit and do nothing. I'm a person who is always doing a lot of things, so I find it hard to do nothing. But I think it's just a hard conversation to have with yourself. I think it's one that's worthwhile, especially as you get older and the demands on your time, you know, become more.
Thank you for that. So I'd like to bring us to social media and ask you about like myths and misconceptions, kind of maybe some dangerous things which are pushed by influencers, quote unquote, in the space. Like, have you noticed any particular trends over the years in social media around you need to do this for your immune system, things that might not make sense? And where do people go for information if they want to get good information on?
It's hard. It's really extreme. Everything that's suggested always seems really extreme, like extreme detoxes and extreme cleanses and lots of money on supplements and huge battery of, you know, whatever tests, stool testing, things like that, and
Blood glucose monitoring.
Yeah, that's the recent one.
I mean, that is the recent one. Everybody's doing so.
Yeah. I actually have one at home. I haven't put it on yet because I'm like, I was asked to test it.
I've not done it.
I don't know if I can be bothered with all the hassle.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure. I was like, how is this really going to change my life?
Yeah, exactly.
I get maybe some foods are more like, is it insulinogenic? Is that what you say?
Or your body maybe handles it less favorably than others. But then I want to answer the question is, you know, I would want to know if these foods are deemed according to the test as being worse for my blood sugar, can I improve my way of dealing with those foods?
Exactly.
You know,
by eating it with other foods, for example, right?
Exactly. Or just improving my microbiome, my digestion, rather than just avoiding the food. I think this is a big part of it with food intolerances. It's always like, oh, if I remove that food, I feel better. And then I remove another food, I feel better. Ask yourself, why do you need to remove really healthy foods like, I don't know, certain vegetables or... we're trying to take away things instead of asking why our body can't deal with that in the first place. And it probably can't deal with that in the first place because our gut is out of whack. And it's not just us who digest our food. In fact, humans are not very good at digesting food. That's why we outsource it to our microbes. So if our microbes are out of whack, then we're not going to be very good at digesting our food. And so it's not about keep removing foods. It's about figuring out how to get 100%. Our body better.
and typically... if people just keep eating something, maybe not in as much quantity as they were before, the body and the microbiome does adapt. And they don't feel as bad anymore. You know, so we hear a lot about like low FODMAP diet, for example, for IBS. Low FODMAP is actually really restrictive.
Yes.
And it can become less restrictive when you start reintroducing stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good way to start, and then versions of it are good longer term sustainable solutions. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about changing the microorganisms.
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about, really.
Yeah.
So just removing everything is a starting point.
Yeah.
That might help you reset and recalibrate.
Exactly, and figure out, it's whenever I eat, a giant bowl of whatever, I get
broccoli.
I get this like gastro feedback.
Mm-hmm.
What if instead of having like a giant pile of it, I just have a small portion?
Just have a little bit. Yeah.
And then slowly over time build up. And I speak to people all the time and they're like, oh, but I eat so well and I've got all these gut symptoms. And I'm thinking, you've been on this planet like 4 decades. Your gut didn't just suddenly get out of whack. It's been a long, slow
100%.
burn. And so it's not going to just fix itself overnight. You have to coax that ecosystem back to where it should be.
100%.
But again, we're really impatient. And we're like,
we want it all now.
Yeah, we want it all now.
Maybe at some point, not too distant future, you'll be able to take an antibiotics capsule,
Exactly.
which contains the full spectrum and the full complement. But one of my worries is that, well, maybe people say, well, instead of actually changing my diet for 3 months, I'm going to take a capsule, which is what people want.
Yeah.
Right? And to be fair, I think that the capsules that we're producing, because they contain the full spectrum, could actually have the same effect as having a good diet for 3 months.
Yeah.
But you don't get all the micronutrients and all the other benefits that you get eating a good diet. So we need to be careful we don't go down this route of one pill for your microbiome.
Exactly. It's educating the consumer or whoever's involved about how they're working hand in hand. It's not just like one or the other. You still need to be
100%.
putting the right food into the system.
Food is so important, isn't it?
So important.
Now, when you were doing your immunology degree, did you talk about food? Did you talk about the microbiome?
Talked a lot about the gut and talked a lot about fiber, actually, just because the microbiome was just starting to become a thing. And I went to work in Switzerland for a while, and we were looking at the role of short-chain fatty acids, which is these things that are metabolites of fiber being broken down, and how butyrate, which is one of these short-chain fatty acids, there's a receptor for butyrate on certain immune cells, so it's having a functional effect on their behavior. And it's really important for the regulating side of our immune system, so dampening down that sort of unwanted inflammatory response. And it's also really important for the gut barrier. So we spoke about this in the beginning, this really long, thin, 1 cell thick tube, and we're chucking all this stuff in it all day long. And this barrier is so critical.
So important.
And if the barrier, it's a dynamic thing, but if the barrier does get a bit leaky, bits of the stuff inside the gut is able to leak into the body, and those bits of stuff are going to be an alarm bell to your immune system going, oh my God, there's stuff in here that shouldn't be here, get the inflammation going, and raising up inflammation. And actually each time we eat, we get a transient postprandial inflammatory response.
Is that right?
You're like, oh no,
what?
I'm never eating again.
No. Genuinely.
But if you're healthy, it's fine. It's like that collateral that your body has a buffer and a capacity to deal with.
One question, sorry, because my mind's going crazy now. So, you know how in Zoe they measure your blood glucose? Are some foods more immunogenic than others? Like, do some foods produce like a greater immune system response? Now, presumably, if it's got a load of Campylobacter in it, then the immune system goes crazy. But, like, are there any other properties other than the presence of microorganisms that might sort of kick it off?
I think it's possible. I think all the bits of microorganisms and other stuff that's in our food, there could be microplastics, which we know can release an inflammatory response, from the plastic, bit of the food supply chain.
So it can be anything.
Yeah, it can be anything.
And maybe it's not a bad thing, actually, for your immune system to kind of get that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of baked into the design. Like the gut barrier has to become transiently more leaky to help with the absorption of nutrients.
Of course.
And so you have this kind of collateral.
Of course.
But I think the problem is that this is happening all the time and we're not giving the body what it needs to repair the barrier. So butyrate is really, really important as a fuel source for those barrier cells. So if we're not eating enough fiber and we don't have the right microbes to produce the butyrate, then we haven't got that kind of barrier repair. And also if we're eating all the time, there's never a break for your gut barrier. And I think that's something that is
too,
we started looking into when I was in Switzerland. And, we've kind of moved from I'm not saying 3 meals a day is the best way to eat, because I think that is a kind of construct in itself. But we've kind of moved towards a kind of grazing culture. We're just eating all the
100%.
time. And we've really pathologized ever feeling hungry. Like, it's like you can't go out the house without 10 snacks, and then you're at the bus stop and there's things telling you that you need another snack, or, you know, we're constantly eating. So, you know, the gut's constantly working.
Needs a break.
And it needs a break. And I think that's an area of science that I would love to see really evolved and fleshed out, because I'm not sure we quite understand. There's the migrating motor complex, which we know takes our foods through, migrates down the digestive tract, and that's also controlled by the circadian rhythm. So eating meals at the same time, you know, you get hungry around 1 o'clock because you always have lunch at 1 o'clock. Your body's like, oh, it's going to switch on digestion now because I'm about to eat, because we always eat at this time, and then it's ready to receive the food. And if you actually prepare your own food, you're smelling it, you're touching it, it's like Pavlov's dogs. It's, you know, you haven't just walked into Pret and grabbed a sandwich and stuffed it in your mouth. I think there's something really in the preparation of food as being quite an important part of the digestive experience.
Making the food.
Chewing it properly, the smell, you know, if you're just preparing a meal and the room becomes filled with the smell of food and the sort of sensory experience, I think sets off your digestive processes, and that's making your body ready to receive the food. You're going to be better able to digest it properly, because it's kind of, you're giving yourself the right setting for it. But when we're grazing all the time,
or
barely chewing, eating too quickly, definitely guilty of that one.
Me too. I eat standing up in the office, and everyone's like, I know I need to stop.
It's really hard. I think we also get into habits, don't we? And all of these things I say because I try and apply them to myself, and I'm definitely not perfect, but I almost try and bring people along with me on, like, let's advocate for each other, let's try our best to implement these things, because I really think they matter, and they matter when we do them consistently over time. But it isn't hard. It isn't easy to do it in
and on the leaky gut side, then, like, for a long time people just didn't believe leaky gut was actually a real thing.
I know, yeah.
It was one of these sort of things that only naturopaths would talk about. However, now I'm seeing it appear more and more in what I'll call mainstream medicine.
Yeah.
So based on the work that you've looked at and the work that you've done, are you convinced that it's a real thing? And if so, what can we do about it? Yeah,
it's definitely a real thing. I think it has been sort of hijacked by that community that the conventional scientists look at as being a bit more pseudoscience. Right. But I think you can't. I mean, you just have to look in the literature, and there's really strong links with this and autoimmune diseases as well, which I think is just fascinating. What can we do about it? I think there's certain foods that cause a greater degree of permeability in the gut, saturated fat. So that's something that we're sort of told anyway at a public health level to reduce. Fructose, which, you know, you're thinking your high fructose corn syrups, which are added to lots of processed foods.
Glucose, fructose syrups.
Yeah, so they're quite harsh on the gut. And then just not having enough fiber, because that's the raw materials to produce the short-chain fatty acids, which are going to help sort of seal the gut up. And having the right microbes to deal with the fiber as well. It's, you know, if you're not eating a lot of fiber and then tomorrow you massively up your fiber by 20 grams, you're going to get a bit of feedback there.
That's the other thing, right? It's about that kind of gradual improvement. You know, improving your microbiome and your gut health isn't something that you can do in one day. Because as you mentioned at the start, it's the sum of everything that's ever happened to you up until now.
Yeah, exactly.
Which brings me on to kids, and you'll be surprised at the time, by the way, we've been going for like over 1 hour and 20 minutes now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you just go into a time warp when you're on a podcast. I want to talk about children and their immune systems and their diets, and then we can wrap up. There's still a million things I wanted to discuss, but I'm just mindful of the time.
Yeah.
This has been a fascinating conversation, by the way, so thank you. So for people out there who are parents, there's tons of conflicting information about, you know, diet and allergies, and this is what you should be feeding your children, this is what you shouldn't. I guess at the end of the day, they'll eat what they want to eat in many respects. Yeah. But what kind of advice do you have for parents around children? Because I guess certainly from the microbiome perspective, the early years are actually really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining that's probably the same for the immune system as well. So,
Yeah. There's this really close link between the gut microbiome and the immune system, the gut immune axis that we call it. And it starts even before birth. You know, if you look in the gut of a baby in utero, there's metabolites from the mother's digestive tract in the baby.
Wow.
So it's like what the mum is
Wow.
eating and her bacteria are producing
It's amazing.
is being transferred. And it's sort of, then obviously the journey into the world really matters. There's these kind of big rocks that shape the baby's microbiome. So obviously vaginal birth is that kind of seeding event where we know there's differences between a C-section baby and a vaginal birth baby. But I always want to be really compassionate to parents, because a lot of these things, it's such an emotional time, and a lot of people don't choose to have a C-section, but it might have been life-saving. And so I always tell people to think about it. This is sort of done at an epidemiological level. So if you take a whole population of babies, the ones born by C-section might show a trend towards a different microbiome than those born vaginally. It doesn't mean that your child has this, trajectory of ill health ahead of them.
That's a really good point.
But the next one is breastfeeding, which I think now there seems to be evidence that has more of an influence than route of birth, because breast milk contains these particular sugars that for a long time they were thinking that they're not really for the baby, but they're actually for the microbes.
The oligosaccharides.
The HMOs, the human milk oligosaccharides. So they're a beautiful fertilizer for this new infant gut, which is all kind of fresh and new. And, we're relatively sterile as we come out into the world, compared to, if you look in the guts of you or I, we've got about maybe 2 kilos of bacteria in there and all sorts of other stuff, whereas a baby, it's brand new and it's suddenly in this germy world. And so the milk, these oligosaccharides in the breast milk are the fertilizer to, you've got a brand new garden, you want to put the right fertilizer on so you get the right things to grow and create the right ecosystem and not have all the weeds and stuff you don't want.
Beautiful analogy.
Yeah,
Beautiful
so I
analogy.
kind of think it's really, really important. And actually the baby's microbiome is not very diverse. We always talk about diversity as being this kind of metric of a healthy microbiome, and that's how it's meant to be. It's only after the first couple of years that diversity starts to come about. So I think, things like antibiotics in the early years as well are quite important in having an impact on shaping this. But as for parents, it's a lot of that's out of your control. You can do the best you can. But then, starting to put food into the system, you want to be further cultivating that garden. Absolutely. And unfortunately, I think even compared to when I was a child, the food marketed towards kids isn't perhaps the best food that we should be giving them, but the marketing's really strong. And I think when I was a child, that a lot of that wasn't the option. I just had the same as my parents, grew up in this rural area where we grew a lot of our own food. How
rural were you, by the way? Just off tangent.
I mean, there was a village like a couple of miles away.
Awesome. That's cool.
But I really worry about this explosion we have in the future because we're not nurturing the gut microbiome of kids correctly. 100%. And I think I have conversations with parents all the time, and a lot of parents are like, oh, when I was a kid, I was really picky, but then I got, over time they'll sort themselves out, they'll start eating different foods. But I'm not sure that it's the same for kids now as it was 3, 4 or 5 decades ago.
So I think 3, 4, 5 decades ago you could be picky, but you still had minimally processed,
there wasn't
more nutrient dense type foods.
Definitely.
Whereas now you can buy stuff that has no nutritional value really whatsoever.
Exactly.
Which is pretty scary.
It's really scary.
And if that's what children are being brought up on, that's not the best way to start your life.
Yeah.
And you get used to these foods.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the back of a packet of something and the ingredients list is like a page long.
Yeah.
That's probably not a good thing.
No, exactly.
That's probably bad.
I think the combination of all these different additives to give it the mouth feel and the
Yep.
taste and the shelf life. We don't actually quite know the impact of that. There's a little bit of emerging evidence of that might not be the best for our microbiome.
100%.
But then you've got, people my age who are like, they're doing Zoe, they're buying all the probiotics, whatever, because they've got all these gut issues. And I'm like, but your child is like an opportunity to not give them the same gut issues a few years down the line. And we're not very good at those slow burn effects, are we? We kind of don't think about a few decades down the line that's going to be a problem. Yeah, because it's too far in the future that it's hard to make changes. And I'm really sympathetic to parents, because as a parent myself, there's the whole like social aspect, like my kids are the ones with the weird food, and I'm like, it's not weird, that should be normal.
Yeah, no, that's normal. Yeah.
And I'm like, when did the world become that this is weird? Just because
exactly.
and also as a working parent, it's a lot of effort to prepare everything, and I do it because I'm me and I've decided to take that route.
Good
but
for you.
I do know that it's hard.
It's really hard.
So especially if I'm obviously coming from a place where I'm informed. But if you have no idea, if no one's ever mentioned that your kid's microbiome might be really critical for their future health, you're not going to have the same kind of information to make those decisions about what they eat.
Sorry to cut you off. I guess there's the cost element as well now.
Yeah.
I bought a packet of organic blueberries and raspberries before I came here to eat tomorrow before I got on the plane.
Yeah.
£9.
Oh,
it's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot of money.
It's a lot. And
to
if
invest
you
in yourself.
You buy that and then your kid decides, today I'm not eating raspberries and blueberries, and they go off in the fridge really quickly. You want to buy something that's really shelf stable, that 100%. That if they don't eat it today, it can be there in a month's time. And so it's really hard.
What about smoothies and juices? Do you give them to your children? Maybe it's something a bit easier, or try to stick to the real foods?
I try to stick to the real foods. I think personally I'm not a big fan of a smoothie, and that's just purely like, I don't know, it's not my favorite way to consume things, so that's why I don't do it for them so much. But they're pretty good, I think, because how I look at it is that we have a bit of a toxic food environment, so I curate our own food environment at home. I just don't buy the stuff that I don't want them to have. They go to birthday parties, they knock themselves out on the Haribo. It's fine. I mean, I'm not going to...
hyper.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to stand there and be like, you're not having that at a birthday party, because it's not all the time. And I think that's the thing. It's not about being perfect. It's what you do most of the time, and giving them a real baseline of, this is what a normal plate of food looks like. So, in 20 years' time, when I'm not around with them, when they're cooking, they know that a normal plate of food doesn't look like a plate of ultra-processed foods. And so they've had that kind of blueprint to work from, and so I'm kind of hoping that works out, but we'll report back in a few years.
Thank you for that. We've been going for quite a while now. I wondered if maybe we could finish up by you telling the listeners where they can follow you, and where's the best platform essentially if they want to ask you a question, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I'm most active on Instagram. It's just my name. I have tried other social media platforms, but one is enough, really. But it's been a real honor and a pleasure to grow that community. It's just sort of happened organically. It's been the sandbox for my mind. I test out ideas and share research that I'm reading, and I love to see how people respond, and it's a really lovely community. I do have a website. It's not always very up to date, but I write on my Substack and do a monthly newsletter, so you can also find that there as well.
And you've written 2 books. The second one was The Blueprint for
Strong Immunity, which is more kind of the practical stuff, and a bit of the psychology, because I always think that health is not just immunology, it's the psychology, it's the application of it.
And might you write another book in the future?
I'm contemplating.
Yeah, I'm thinking you should write one about the microbiome and the immune system. I think you'd be perfect for that with your expertise, and your writing's really, really good. And on Audible as well, you're talking.
Yes, I
it's
did
good to hear the author's passion.
I did the audiobook.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Learned a lot, and really grateful we can make this happen.
Yeah,
so appreciate
I'm so pleased. Thanks.
Thank you.